Roshan, not so very far from here, in 1916, an editorial meeting of Fabians associated with the New Statesman magazine held a meeting to evaluate the rising of the Irish people in the General Post Office in O'Connell Street in Dublin, and declined to offer any certificate of approbation to this Irish rising. They declared that the forces involved in the rising of Easter 1916 were too priest-ridden, too obscurantist, too shrouded in Irish mist, and could not possibly pass the liberal tests set by the Fabians in London. They didn't realize or understand that the only certificate of approbation required by those rising for Irish freedom were the certificates issued by the Irish people themselves. And the same is true of Iran. I actually don't agree with many things in Iran. I don't agree with many things about their political system. But the only certificate the Iranian leadership needs is that issued by the people of Iran, not by liberals in the West or by imperialists either. Now, coming from Scotland, of Irish Catholic background, when I saw that Chris Hedges was a Presbyterian minister, well, I wasn't looking forward to our meeting as much as I would ordinarily. But Chris Hedges, as was said of the late and great John Smith, has all the virtues of the Presbyterian and none of the vices. He is quite simply, I know he will disagree, but in my view, the finest, leading, most erudite, most clever, most eloquent opponent of imperialism in the world today. Please welcome the great Chris Hedges.
The final stages of capitalism, Karl Marx predicted, are marked by global capital being unable to expand and generate profits at former levels. Capitalism then consumes the government, physical and social structures that sustains it. Democracy, social welfare, protection of the natural world, electoral fairness, programs that advance the common good are sacrificed. As corporations privatize public transportation, roads, bridges, utilities, education, and health care to feed their lust for profit. And these assaults eventually destroy the host. The human species, led by white Europeans and Euro-Americans, has been on a 500-year-long planet-wide rampage of conquering, plundering, looting, exploiting, and polluting the earth, as well as killing the indigenous communities that stood in the way. But the game is up. The technical and scientific forces that created a life of unparalleled luxury, as well as unrivaled military and economic power for a small, global, largely white elite, are the forces that now doom us. The mania for ceaseless economic expansion and exploitation, which includes the trashing of the ecosystem on which we depend for life, has become a curse, a death sentence. And it turns out that those who truly hate us for our freedoms are not the array of dehumanized enemies cooked up by empire and the war machine. The Vietnamese, Cambodians, Afghans, Iraqis, Iranians, or even the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. They are the financiers, bankers, politicians, public intellectuals and pundits, lawyers, journalists, and business people, cultivated in the elite universities and business schools who sold us the utopian absurdity of neoliberalism and employ the classic tools of totalitarianism to keep us compliant. Because the fact is, when a government watches and tracks you 24 hours a day, as yours and mine does, you cannot use the word liberty. This is the relationship between a master and a slave. These corporate mandarins are, if we speak in the language of God and country, traitors. They are parasites. Financial speculation in the 17th century was a crime. Speculators were hanged. The heads of most of today's banks and hedge funds and the executives of large corporations such as Apple, Walmart, or Gap that run sweatshop death traps for impoverished workers overseas and drive down the living standards at home deserve prison far more than most of the poor students of color I teach within the prison system in the United States, people who never had a fair trial or a chance in life. When a tiny cabal seizes power, monarchist, communist, fascist, or corporate, it creates a mafia economy and finally a mafia state. Political figures such as Donald Trump or Theresa May, who drove children into poverty at the fastest rate in Great Britain since 1988, or Boris Johnson, are not anomalies. They are the grotesque visage of a collapsed democracy. These con artists and deviants play the role of the Snopes clan in some of William Faulkner's novels. The Snopeses filled the power vacuum of the decayed South and ruthlessly seized control from the degenerated former slaveholding aristocratic elites. Flem Snopes and his extended family, which includes a killer, a pedophile, a bigamist, an arsonist, a mentally disabled man who copulates with a cow, and a relative who sells tickets to witness the bestiality, are fictional representations of the degenerates now elevated to power. They embody the moral rot unleashed by unfettered capitalism. The usual reference to amorality, while accurate, is not sufficiently distinctive and by itself does not allow us to place them as they should be placed in a historical moment. The critic Irving Howe wrote of the Snopeses, perhaps the most important thing to be said is that they are what comes afterwards. The creatures that emerge from the devastation with the slime still upon their lips. Let a world collapse in the South or Russia, and there appear figures of coarse ambition driving their way up from beneath the social bottom, men to whom moral claims are not so much absurd as incomprehensible. Sons of bushwhackers or musics drifting in from nowhere and taking over through the sheer outrageousness of their monolithic force, Howe wrote. They become presidents of local banks and chairmen of party regional committees, and later, a trifle slicked up, they muscle their way into Congress or the Politburo. Scavengers without inhibition, they need not believe in the crumbling official code of their society. They need only learn to mimic its sounds. These little fears are always buffoonish. Such strutting demagogues appalled liberal elites in the 1930s. The German novelist Thomas Mann wrote in his diary 2 months after the Nazis came to power that he had witnessed a revolution without underlying ideas, against everything nobler, better, decent, against freedom, truth, and justice. He lamented that the common scum had taken power, accompanied by vast rejoicing on the part of the masses. The business elites in Germany may not have liked this scum, just as they look warily at Trump and probably Johnson, but they are willing to work with them rather than set any limits on their plunder. And our business elites will do the same. Evil for these demagogues is embodied in the dehumanized other. And once the human personification of evil is eradicated, evil itself is supposed to disappear. Except, of course, it doesn't. As soon as one group of evil human beings is annihilated, another human embodiment of evil rises to take its place. The Nazis began with Jews. Our demagogues are beginning with Muslims, immigrants, the undocumented, and now we see journalists. What comes next, history has shown, may not be pleasant. A corrupt and inept ruling elite backed by the organs of state security and law enforcement, transforming workers into serfs. The most benign dissent criminalized, the ravaging of the ecosystem propelling us towards extinction. Hate talk as stagnation and decay continues, calling for attacks against Muslims, undocumented workers, people of color, feminists, intellectuals, artists, dissidents, all of whom will be scapegoated for the country's stagnation. Magical thinking dominating the airwaves and taught in public schools. Art and culture degraded to nationalist kitsch. Any exposure by the press or whistleblowers of the inner workings of power criminalized, which is why Julian is in Belmarsh prison. All the cultural and intellectual disciplines that allow us to view the world from the perspective of the other, that foster empathy, understanding, and compassion, replaced by vocational and technological training and a grotesque hypermasculinity and hypermilitarism. The language of racism, bigotry, misogyny, and homophobia defining our national discourse. The corporate state, hostile or indifferent to the plight of citizens, has no emotional pull anymore on the public. It is hated. Political candidates run not as politicians, but celebrities. Campaigns execute issues to make people feel good about candidates and themselves. Ideas become irrelevant. Emotional euphoria is paramount. The voter is only a prop in political theater. Politics, as we see with Brexit, becomes anti-politics. It is reality television. Fact and knowledge do not matter. Reality is what you create. Entertainment is paramount. The skillful manipulation of emotion is confused with knowledge. Narratives begin to believe not because they are true or even sound true, but because they are emotionally appealing. We must allow ourselves to feel grief for what we have done and are doing to the planet. We must name the psychosis that afflicts us. And perhaps the greatest existential crisis of our time is to accept the bleakness of the reality before us and yet find the strength to resist. And this means carrying out sustained acts of civil disobedience to re-empower others and ourselves. We must fend off the madness, which means turning off our electronic hallucinations, and engage in dialogues with those around us, as we are doing tonight, based on truth, literacy, empathy, and reality. We must invest more time in finding solace in nature, music, theater, literature, art, even worship, activities that hold the capacity for renewal and transcendence. This is the only way we will remain psychologically whole. Building an outer shell, retreating into screens, succumbing to cynicism and despair will only exacerbate our psychological distress and depression. As the state increases the level of violence against dissent, we must never respond with violence. The use of violence, including property destruction and taunting the police, is a gift to the security and surveillance state. It allows the state to demonize and isolate a mass movement. It drives away the bulk of the population. Violence against the state is used by the authorities to justify greater forms of control and oppression. This is a game the government will always win and we will always lose. If we are perceived as a flag-burning, rock-throwing, angry mob that embraces violence, we will be easily crushed. If we are to succeed, we will have to make alliances with people and groups whose professed political stances are different from ours and at times unpalatable to us. We will have to shed our ideological purity. The Chicago organizer Saul Alinsky argued that the ideological rigidity of the left, something epitomized in identity politics and political correctness, effectively severed it from the lives of working men and women. This was especially true during the Vietnam War, when college students led the anti-war protests and the sons of the working class did the fighting and dying in Vietnam. But it is true today, as liberals and the left dismiss Trump or anti-Brexit supporters as irredeemable racists and bigots and ignore their legitimate feelings of betrayal and their very real suffering. Writing off those who support leaving Brexit or backing Trump is political suicide. Alinsky detested such moral litmus tests. He stole this from Lord Salisbury. He insisted there were no permanent enemies, no permanent allies, only permanent power. We can win the hearts and minds of the wider public only through these acts of sustained mass civil disobedience, as Extinction Rebellion showed us in London in April, centered around issues of universal justice. We can succeed only if we win over at least some of those within the structures of power, as I saw when I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, including the police. When violence is used against nonviolent protesters demanding justice, it exposes the weakness of the state. It delegitimizes those in power. It prompts a passive population to respond with active support for the protesters. It creates internal divisions within the structures of power, as I recognized in these revolutions, to paralyze and defeat those in authority. Alexander Herzen, speaking to a group of anarchists a century ago about how to overthrow the Russian Tsar, reminded his listeners that it was not their job to save a dying system, but replace it. We think we are the doctors, Herzen said. We are the disease. We have the numbers to make any country ungovernable, but we do not have much time. The corporate regimes will make it harder and harder to organize, get into the streets, and carry out nationwide strikes. Now is the time not to cooperate. Now is the time to shut down the systems of power. Now is the time to resist. It is our last chance. The fanatics are moving with lightning speed, so should we. The moment we rise up to defy this radical evil in the streets, we are victorious. The moment we stand alongside the oppressed and accept being treated like the oppressed, we are victorious. The moment we hold up a flickering light in the darkness for others to see another narrative, another way of being, we are victorious. The moment we reopen a public library or save a public school, we are victorious. The moment we shut down a London bridge or road, we are victorious. The moment we thwart the building of a pipeline or a fracking site, we are victorious. And the moment those in power fear us, we are victorious. I do not know if we can build a better society. I do not even know if we will survive as a species. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists.